Good evening. As a lot of you know, I'm Lolita Buckner-Innes. I'm the Dean of the University of Colorado Law School, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to the 48th Annual Austin W. Scott Jr. Lecture, which tonight will be given by Professor Andrew Schwartz. The title of his lecture is Digital Shareholders. Before I go further, I want to pause for a moment and say to you that as we gather, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado Law School is on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. This lecture, named for Austin Scott, is one of the highlights of our Colorado law academic year. Austin Scott was a member of the law school faculty for 20 years, and this lecture has for many years featured a member of the Colorado law faculty selected by the dean, that's me in this instance, and that member is someone who is engaged in a highly significant scholarly project. And I can say to you that while certainly we have many, many accomplished faculty members, I have been deeply, deeply impressed with the work of Professor Schwartz. And so this was, despite having so many wonderful people on our faculty, this was an easy choice to make. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor Schwartz. Andrew A. Schwartz joined the University of Colorado Law School faculty in 2008, and he was promoted to full professor in 2017. He teaches and he publishes on corporate securities and contract law and has become nationally and internationally recognized, I might add, in terms of the work that he's done on investment crowdfunding. Professor Schwartz earned a Sci-B in civil engineering from Brown University and a JD from Columbia University, where he served on the Columbia Law Review and was named a James Kent Scholar. This represents top honors for all 3 years of his law school career. Professor Schwartz is not only the author of a book, Investment Crowdfunding, published by Oxford University Press. He has also been a prolific scholar who has published widely beyond his book and has authored more than 40 scholarly publications. He has won numerous national awards for his scholarship, and his research is frequently cited and relied upon by courts and commentators across the country and around the world. Tonight, Professor Schwartz will discuss aspects of his new book, Investment Crowdfunding. And in this discussion, he will explore recent changes in law that authorized a new form of online stock market trading for startup companies, open to the whole public, known as investment crowdfunding. Finally, as he will tell us, ordinary people, though the longer that I'm on this earth, I'm of the opinion that there's no such thing as an ordinary person. We're all extraordinary. However, relatively ordinary people are now allowed to invest in startup companies, and millions of Americans have already taken the plunge and invested billions of dollars in many companies from coast to coast. I could go on and on. However, I want to get right to the main event tonight. And so I'm going to ask you to please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Schwartz as he comes to the podium.
Thank you very much. It's great to see you all tonight. Let me begin by thanking Yesenia and the rest of the staff that put this event on, my family, my colleagues for being here, and those online as well. And since this is a longstanding tradition here at the University of Colorado, I thought I'd mention that not only am I going to thank our current dean for giving me the honor of delivering the Scott Lecture this year, but I want to thank our prior deans. I've been here for since 2008, as mentioned, and so let me thank Dean Getches, who was kind enough to bring me on the faculty. And then we had Dean Phil Weiser, who in my early years as a scholar encouraged me. It was a very memorable moment. I presented a paper that I was hoping to publish as an article, and it was pretty good, and I was saying, well, I just want to get it out there. And Dean Weiser, now Attorney General, said to me, we're not going for base hits. We're looking for home runs. And from then on, that's what I've been trying to seek. And after a few more years, Dean Weiser was succeeded by Dean Anaya, who's in the audience today. And at a pivotal moment in my career, I had an annual review with him, and he said to me, more or less, you've written enough articles on investment crowdfunding. It's time to write a book. And so I did. And hopefully, I tried to make it a home run, and we'll see. And then finally, once again, let me thank Dean Innes, who's leading the school to future glory here today. And I really appreciate the opportunity to give this lecture following the footsteps of colleagues that I see out in the room and whose work I really respect. So in the beginning, there was Kickstarter, and it was good. Kickstarter was a way, and it started in about the year 2008. Kickstarter was a way for artists and entrepreneurs and mostly creative types to raise money for their projects on the internet. And people just would post up an idea. We're a rock band. We want to record an album. We need $50,000 to go in the studio and make this happen. And the fans of the band or people who just thought that was interesting would contribute. And the next logical step was Kickstarter worked on a model of reward crowdfunding. So in the band example, if you contributed, let's say, $20 to the band's project, you would receive the album once it was completed. So the next logical step was to allow these backers to not only receive an album or your name in the credits of a movie or whatever it was, but to receive the opportunity to invest in the very company and project that you thought that you supported. It sounds like a great idea. There's only one problem. It's entirely illegal. It was a direct violation of the Securities Act of 1933, which has been around for quite some time, as you can imagine. And essentially, it's okay to offer to the public a T-shirt, an album, your name in the credits, other things like that. But if you offer to the broad public a security, which means an opportunity to invest and earn a financial return, you must register those securities with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And registration is an expensive and time-consuming process where the company that's raising money needs to register with the SEC, a huge stack of mandatory disclosures. What is the company? What are the finances? What are the risks? And there's good reasons for that, and that process is called an IPO, an initial public offering. There are good reasons for that, but it costs several $million to go through that process. And if you're a startup and you need to raise $50,000 for your band or $300,000 to develop your app or whatever it is, it's obviously infeasible to spend millions of dollars in the process of doing so. So going back to 1933 in the Securities Act, there are a number of exemptions to the registration requirement where if you sell securities in certain ways, you are exempt. You don't have to file that registration with the SEC. And the two most important exemptions, and these have been used for decades and decades, are, number one, a private offering. If the Securities Act and the federal laws about this are designed to deal with public offerings of securities, like on the New York Stock Exchange. But if you merely are selling securities to your friends and family or to people that you know, that's a private matter and you are exempt from registering. Another key exemption is called the accredited investor exemption. And if you sell securities not to the broad public, but only to investors that are accredited, and I'll tell you in a moment what that means, you're likewise exempt. And accredited investors include professional investors and banks and university endowments, and also wealthy people of a certain amount of wealth. Basically, if you have $1 million to invest, the law views you as accredited. And it's not because the law thinks people that have $1 million are smarter than people that have 990,000. The idea is that if you have that much money to invest, you could withstand the losses that will inevitably come if you invest in unregistered speculative securities. These two exemptions basically describe the startup funding ecosystem that we've had for many decades. Friends and family and accredited investors like venture capitalists, for example. But what about people who don't have wealthy friends and family? What about entrepreneurs who live far from Silicon Valley, don't know any venture capitalists or things like that? It was thought, wait, we could use this crowdfunding system, like on Kickstarter, to give these other entrepreneurs, maybe kind of out-of-the-loop entrepreneurs, a chance. And so, like I said, this would have been illegal under the Securities Act of 1933, but hey, Congress can change it. And so it did. In the year 2012, there was a huge bipartisan law passed called the Jobs Act, Jumpstart Our Business Startups, Jobs Act, signed by President Obama in April of 2012. And it created a new exemption from the registration requirement for crowdfunded securities, as long as you follow all the rules and regulations in that statute and in the associated regulations that were published by the SEC called Regulation Crowdfunding. These regulations, I'll have to say, are kind of voluminous, but nothing compared to doing a full public offering like an IPO on the New York Stock Exchange. And many other countries followed in our footsteps and enacted their own investment crowdfunding exemptions. And so this is what I've been studying for the last roughly 10 years, and this is what the book is all about and the talk tonight. So let me just say what my definition of investment, what is investment crowdfunding? I define it in the book as, and now you'll understand what I mean, a public offering of unregistered securities through an independent online platform, like Kickstarter. And I've sort of hinted at this, but let me clarify. The statute, this law, had really three primary policy goals. There were three things that Congress and the president was trying to achieve. First, to create a new source of capital for startup companies. Startup companies create jobs, they grow the economy, they develop new products and services. It's socially useful. Let's get more capital to them. But the other two goals are really both related to inclusivity in two different ways. The second goal that I see, and I think this is widely shared, the second goal of investment crowdfunding is to create an opportunity for inclusive entrepreneurship. like I said, if you don't have wealthy friends and family, if you don't have connections to venture capitalists, if you live far from Silicon Valley, the statistics are pretty stark about venture capital funding, how much of it goes to women and minorities. It's quite small. And the idea here was for entrepreneurs of all types, especially those who are kind of out of the loop, to get a chance to pitch their idea to the crowd and get funded, get off the ground. And then the third policy goal, the first was just to create a new avenue for startup companies. The second is inclusive entrepreneurship. And the third is inclusive or democratized investment. Like I said, if you are an accredited investor, for the last many decades, you've had the opportunity to invest in startup companies, or if you're connected to, if you're Mark Zuckerberg's cousin, you had the chance to invest. But if you're an ordinary person and not an accredited investor, the law, in a paternalistic way to protect you from investing in such speculative things, the law previously had not allowed you to invest. This new exemption is open to the whole public to allow non-accredited investors, everyone, to participate. And well, how's it going? The law was passed in 2012. The SEC was very busy, and it took them 4 years to put out the regulations. So really, this market started in about 2016, and I have a couple of slides here to show you how it's going so far. So as far as a new source of capital for startup companies, we can see here that in that first year, there was like $20 million raised across the whole country. But more recently, we're up to about $500 million is raised each year through investment crowdfunding. And I feel obliged to say this graph ends in 2021 because that was the latest data that I published in the book. But I will tell you, for better or worse, this kind of flatlined in the next 2 years, in 22 and 23. But venture capital funding in those years dropped precipitously. So staying flat over the last few years is really actually a pretty good showing. That said, our venture capital industry in the US outshines the whole rest of the world and is enormous. And so even at this point, this represents maybe 1% of the venture capital funding that's put together each year. But hey, this was 0.1%. So it's growing quite nicely. What about inclusive entrepreneurship? I have statistics here showing that female founders in venture capital receive, and there's different statistics, but somewhere in the range of less than 10% of the funding from venture capitalists. In investment crowdfunding, and the data that I'm using is the largest raises from the most recent year that I had data for, but the numbers are similar otherwise. Female founders represent nearly half of the companies that raise money through investment crowdfunding, and minority founders, likewise, in venture capital, maybe 20, 25%. In investment crowdfunding, again, 40-something percent. Most of, and then here we have the number of offerings per year. In these early years, a few hundred each year, but in these more recent years, there's about 1,500 companies that seek funding each year in the US through investment crowdfunding. Most of them you've never heard of because they're startup companies that are just getting off the ground. But there are a few names that you might recognize. In 2017, Meow Wolf raised $1 million on investment crowdfunding to build their Denver exhibit hall and do some other things. And in 2023, off the chart here, but quite recently, the online publisher Substack raised $5 million that year. So the final goal of investment crowdfunding is to make an opportunity for all investors, not just accredited, not just those that have connections. And here we have the number of investors each year. It took a few years to even break 100,000, but since then the growth has really been quite good. Again, it is kind of flat, I'll confess, beyond this date. But again, that's a good showing compared to other forms of startup finance. And so each year, we're talking about 500,000 Americans participate in this market. Now, this is a law school, and so I figured I might as well tell you what the law says. The law in the US does put a number, the Jobs Act and regulation crowdfunding imposes a number of legal rules and limits on the practice. I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of the key regulations, some of the key legal limits are you need a license from the SEC to operate a platform in this way. You can't just start up your own platform. And all offerings must go through a licensed platform. There's a $5 million annual limit of how much money a given company can raise. You can come back next year, do another 5, but $5 million issuer limit, the issuer of the securities. There's also a cap on the individual investors. Remember, these are folks that by definition are not accredited, maybe can't afford to invest their whole life savings into a speculative business. And so the law says you only may invest up to 5% of your net worth annually in all crowdfunded offerings. This meant you can put it all in one or spread it out. Following the tradition on Kickstarter, there's a rule that says, I call it the all or nothing model. You have to, if you're a company that wants to raise funds in this way, you need to announce at the outset, we need to raise at least 200,000 or whatever the number is. That's the target. And only if enough investors pledge to hit enough to hit that target does the deal go through. If it doesn't meet the, capture the attention of the crowd and you don't hit your target, the deal is off. The people that pledge just get their pledges back and the whole deal is canceled. The idea here is to harness the wisdom of the crowd. Good companies will hit their targets, at least perceived by the crowd, and poor ones won't. The key move, as I said, of investment crowdfunding is to exempt these offerings from the usual registration requirement and the mandatory disclosure rules that go with it. But what Congress giveth with one hand, it can taketh away with the other. And so in the law, there are some mandatory disclosures, some financial statements and other things that must be provided by companies that are pursuing this. And then if the company is funded, the company must send their investors an annual report a year later to say how things are going. There's a few more, there's many more legal rules, but I'm not going to go into all those right now. What I want to move ahead to is what's the situation in the rest of the world? Many countries, dozens at this point around the world, have enacted their own investment crowdfunding laws. Most of them followed the US model, like Australia, Canada, the EU, did it basically the way that we did it. The UK and New Zealand both really just got started before the US and without much regulation at all. The UK and New Zealand adopted what I call in the book a liberal model of investment crowdfunding regulations, where there are very few rules, very minimal regulation. Most importantly, there is no mandatory disclosure at all whatsoever in those liberal jurisdictions. And what I'm showing here is how much has been raised each year in a variety of jurisdictions. In blue, we've got the United States, this blue bar for each year. Red, which I'm sure you're noticing, is the United Kingdom, the redcoats. New Zealand is in green because there's beautiful green fields and such there. And Australia is in purple for no good reason. And like I said, the US and Australia and other countries adopted kind of a standard model of investment crowdfunding that most notably includes mandatory disclosure. The UK and New Zealand, you can see New Zealand kind of got off to a good start and has kind of stayed about the same. That's because in New Zealand, they have a very low issuer limit. You may only raise about $1.5 million US if you're that kind of company, and it's a small country, so they've kind of just maxed out. But the UK has really shown the power of this liberal model. And to give you some idea, what I'm showing here is on a per capita basis. So normalizing on the basis of population, it's not fair to compare New Zealand with 5 million people to the US with 300 million. But so on a per capita basis, and I put it all into US dollars, how are these countries doing? And you can see the UK has really outshone the whole rest of the world to the point that there are two, or let me put it this way, angel investors, which are kind of wealthy accredited investors that often give seed funding to startup companies. In the UK, there's currently more investment crowdfunding deals each year than there are angel deals. And it was sort of not what they wanted to hear, but in the UK, there are two dominant crowdfunding platforms. One of them is called Seedrs, one of them is called Crowdcube. And they each have about half the market, or almost. There are some other ones, but they're very small. These two companies sought to merge. Well, it sounded like a good idea to them for the companies, but the UK antitrust regulator blocked the deal and put out a report saying that investment crowdfunding has become, this is a direct quote, such an important part of the financial ecosystem that we're not going to allow this deal to go through. Now, it's sort of a tough break for those two companies that were trying to do the deal, but really a compliment to what they had achieved. And so looking, like I said, the UK kind of did not even enact a special regulatory regime for this. They just licensed a few platforms to do the business and did not impose mandatory disclosure and have very minimal regulations. And so, because of that, they were able to get their market started about 4 years before we did in the US. So they've got this nice head start, and so it's possible that the US will catch up like this. But we can kind of look into the future and see, because just within the last few months, Seedrs, one of those two leading platforms in the UK, and I think they're quite comparable, although I can't swear to that, and I don't precisely know. Seedrs put out a report, a portfolio report, saying we've now raised 1,000 companies have raised money on our platform, and here's the results. So let's see. Seedrs reported that over the last 10 years, this is non-tax adjusted. There's special tax benefits for investing in startups in the UK. But the internal rate of return, how would you do if you invested in these companies? If you had invested 100 pounds, I guess maybe it was euros? No, I don't know. I think it was always pounds. If you had invested 100 pounds into every one of those 1,000 companies over the last 10 years, you would earn a return of nearly 8% over these years. The UK stock market over these years returned about 6.5%. So it was pretty good. This other statistic, fixed percentage, if instead of investing 100 pounds into every offering, you bought 1% of every offering, you would have returned about 13% annual rate of return over these last 10 years. What this is suggesting is that the companies that raised more money in the UK had better results. Because if you invested in this way, it meant you would put 10 times the money into a $5 million raise than you would a $500,000 raise. And this is like when they talk about the S&P 500 and things like that, it's a market-weighted figure, which would be this one. Of the 1,000 companies that have ever raised money on Cedars, about 3/4 are still in business. The other quarter have been wound up, which I think is their nice way of saying went out of business. And one more key statistic that I got from the Cedars report, which, like I said, was just published within the last few months, is this. Cedars looked at their investors, the people on Cedars who invested just one investment versus people who diversified and invested into multiple startups. You could see if you invested on average, if you just took one shot, you didn't do very well. On average, negative 14%, even up to 4% is negative percent. Once you get up to about 10 or more, and especially up to these higher numbers, if you diversified your investments, you did even better. Note, nobody on average did as well as if you had invested in every single one. So investing in all thousands, like the S&P 500, is even better returns than trying to pick winners. It bears noting about 60% of the investors only did invest in one, and about 25% in 2 and 4. Only about 2 or 3% of Cedars investors invested this many. Now, the whole thing has been growing over these years, so we'll see. But this is a key lesson. I'm going to come back to this at the end when I give you some sort of tips for how to invest in this market. The big claim that I make in the book is based on theory and experience is that the liberal model is the way to go. That because, now look, regulations, mandatory disclosure is useful, it's valuable, but it costs money. And when the companies are only raising $300,000, $700,000, up to $5 million, it is just absolutely vital for the thing to work that the cost of raising that money be kept to an absolute minimum. We already have a highly regulated public market. It's called the New York Stock Exchange. But if you want investment crowdfunding to work, and I give this presentation around the world to different regulators in other countries. I say, if you want this to really work, you've got to really minimize the, let me just put this one up. You need to minimize the regulations. One more fact that I guess I didn't mention, but I certainly should have, is why did the US put in all these rules and regulations? A primary reason was concern about fraud. On the internet, believe it or not, sometimes people lie. And if you're investing, by definition, in strangers' startups, people you don't personally know, and these are not registered securities, and it's all online, people were worried, what about fraud? People are going to trick the investors, and the regular folks are going to lose all their money. In fact, Jared Polis, our governor, he was in the U.S. House of Representatives when the Jobs Act was passed. And he stood up, and I don't know if I'm going to do justice to his line, but he stood up and said something like, this new law will finally give ordinary people the chance to lose money that rich people have always had. And so that was the concern, although he ended up voting for it because for reasons that they put in protections and other regulations. So the concern was people are going to get ripped off. The results are as follows. After about 4,000 offerings on investment crowdfunding in the US, there has been one allegation of fraud. And I think it was true. I think it was. In the UK, where they have this liberal model, there's been one allegation of fraud. In New Zealand, guess how many? One. And so, look, there's always going to be one. But the concerns that this was going to be a den of thieves have not come to pass, not only in our relatively highly regulated jurisdiction, but also in the liberal jurisdictions. And so the liberal model keeps costs to an absolute minimum. And by just having one or two regulations, you can really cabin the potential harm that that could happen here. And those one or two regulations are, as I mentioned before, there's the issuer limit, $5 million. Let's say one of them was phony and a con. Well, okay, the people of America would be out $5 million. But that's a limit. There are NFTs and coins of all types that have raised and turned out to be frauds of billions of dollars. They're unlimited. And so instead of trying to prevent everything bad that could happen, the issuer limit minimizes the social harm if something bad does happen. And the investor cap, where each person is only limited to invest up to 5% of their assets, this likewise protects each individual investor from losing their life savings. The most you could possibly lose is 5%. And so with those two protections that cost very, very little to enforce or to comply with, we can have a very liberal set of regulations and not worry so much about what if something bad happens. And the UK's experience is showing it's kind of a nice experiment of how to do it. And well, how do they do it? Why is there a clean market in the UK? Why do investors in the UK invest without all of the usual rules of mandatory disclosure and other things? I spend probably 40% of the book, sorry, dude, she had to read it. I spent about 40% of the book discussing what I call private ordering. Well, not just me, but the private ordering methods, meaning not legal ways to ensure there are good companies listing and that people aren't defrauded, but kind of, economic incentives and private choices of the market participants. And some of the key, I list a whole bunch in the book, but some of the most important methods of private ordering that are in place in the US, in the UK, across the world, some of the most important are, number one, gatekeeping. Gatekeeping. And by this, I mean, like I said, you can't, unlike, I got to think of some coin to make fun of, but unlike some crypto coin, you can't just go and sell securities out to people. You must get listed on an online platform. And this online platform makes money from every listing. Every time somebody buys a share, they get some little percent. So the more investors that come to your platform, the more money you make. And meaning, if you're a platform and you allow a company to list on your site that turns out to be a fraud, well, the investors are not going to come back. They're going to go over to the other platform or something else. Knowing this, the platforms, and the platform could lose its license. Knowing this, the platforms in the US and abroad are extremely selective in selecting which companies they will allow to list. And if a company has even a hint of fraud or just looks like unlikely to succeed, the crowdfunding platforms will not list it. And they tell me here in the US and across the world that they only list 1 or 2 or sometimes 3% of all the companies that seek to list. Now, you might say, wait, isn't that contrary to the inclusive crowdfunding aspect? It is. But it's a balance. And we also, in the US, have dozens of crowdfunding platforms, and in other countries there are many. If you can't get listed on the top one, you can get yourself listed. You can get a chance. So gatekeeping is a key method to protect investors and keep the market honest. Another key method is, there's mandatory disclosure. We could require you to tell the investors about your company, but companies have an incentive to voluntarily disclose without any mandate. If I stood up here and said, I'd like you to invest in my new water bottle company, and you say to me, well, how many water bottles did you sell last year? I'm not telling. How much money do you have in the bank? I'm not telling. You're not going to invest. There's an incentive at the primary offering stage, at least, for companies to voluntarily provide disclosure. And in the UK and New Zealand, they do. There are offering documents that look more or less like what VCs and angels see. Let me just say one or two other methods of private ordering, and then I'm going to get to my last slide, which are the tips for how to successfully invest. This is not an investment advice. This is general education. Another method of private ordering is the wisdom of the crowd. The crowd gets to sort of vote on which companies are going to get funded because the company has to hit its target. That's another key method. I will confess, here in the US, this method has been perverted, maybe I could say, by the platforms who list everybody with like a $10,000 or a $25,000 target. So every company is a winner, everybody is a success. But I'm in talks with the SEC to, look, as you can see, I mostly want to minimize the regulation, but sometimes we do need it. I'm in talks with the SEC to add a regulation that would encourage companies to name realistic targets. And then just the final method of private ordering that I'll mention is, I call it in the book, syndication. And the idea here is, instead of every investor poring over the documents and deciding what to invest in, you get one big investor, a venture capitalist often, who writes on the platform, I'm investing $3 million in this company on the same terms being offered to you. I've pored over the documents. I'm a sophisticated investor. The crowd can kind of follow the lead of that venture capitalist. And by the way, it's useful to the venture capitalist or the other lead investor because it gets a whole lot of additional capital to one of the companies that it's investing in. And it really engages the customers, the fans that love the company. And so that's another benefit of investment crowdfunding. So finally, and let me conclude with this, here's a few tips, general ideas about how you might pick winners or have a better chance of investing successfully in this field. First, I would say follow the crowd. Remember I said in Cedars data, if you invested in the most popular investments, you'd do better than if you invested evenly in all of them. The crowd has some wisdom. Number two, follow the leader. If there is a well-known venture capital firm that's investing, or someone else whose opinion you trust because of their past track record, that's a good way to try to pick which companies you want to invest. Also, use your own knowledge. Everybody knows something. Everybody knows different things, in fact. Maybe you know everything about classical guitar, and you know what's going to be a successful model in that field, or vitamin supplements. Or you might know that the founder of this company went to Seoul National University, and Seoul National University is really one of the top schools in the whole world. You might know things, you do know things that others don't. You could put that to use. And then finally, diversify. And this is what venture capitalists do. They don't invest just in one company. They invest in a suite of 10 or more companies, expecting some of them are going to fail, some aren't really going to do much, but one or two are really going to knock it out of the park. But to find those, you need to diversify your investments. So with that, let me conclude by saying I think this market is off to a strong start. It's growing quickly. It has great potential. The regulations need a few tweaks, as I mentioned, but as I also mentioned, I'm working on it. So with that, let me invite the dean back up to conclude. Sure. Yes. Sorry. Let me take some questions before we do that. And while you're thinking of your questions, let me draw the raffle for the book. There was a book giveaway here tonight, as promised, and so check your tickets. I've picked out number 170559. Yay! It's my research assistant. Congratulations. Congratulations. I'll sign the book for you right after we finish here, Hannah. Thank you. Okay, well, let me take some questions. We have, probably about 10 minutes for questions. And so I think we have one up here in the front, Yesenia, a handsome young man who looks a lot like me.
Is there a minimum age to create a startup on one of these investment platforms, or is there a minimum age to invest in any of these?
It's a good question. Is there a minimum age? I'd say to invest, you probably need to be 18 or with your parents co-signing or your parent working together with your parents. As an entrepreneur, I wrote a whole article called Teenage Crowdfunding. And you could be any age and start a company and get it funded in this way.
I have lots of questions. I'm going to try to contain myself. I guess I'll just try to limit it to two. I guess one of them, and to some extent you allude to this in your remarks and in the book, I understand that it might be useful for VCs to sort of set the direction and say, hey, I like this particular product item, and that may cause people to follow. But I guess I'm concerned about, maybe I shouldn't be, the extent to which or whether VCs might capture what I sort of envisioned initially as a more democratic space for both investors and people seeking funds. I don't know if that's true. The other thing is, the first thing I thought of was my limited knowledge of how these things work. Is there an opportunity for some derivative building based upon what we see going on crowd funding platforms? I could see somebody saying, oh, I can figure out how to do options or derivatives. And in other words, creating a whole other financial product that people might invest in based on what's going on in some of the, at least the major platforms.
Thank you. Good questions. And we can talk more afterwards, of course. In terms of whether VCs will capture this market entirely, no, I don't really think so. I will say that only certain types of companies really capture the crowd's interest. Whereas venture capitalists might be interested in companies that are highly profitable, but just kind of don't tell a great story. So it's only a subset that will, want to do this together. There are also a few instances, like in the UK, there is one of their most popular offerings. I think it's called Monzo. It's like a banking app that it's popular and people love it. And Monzo came out and said on their crowdfunding information something like, the venture capitalists wanted to invest in us, but we didn't want to take their money. We're taking our customers' money. If you believe in us, stick with us. And so there's a bit of a movement to kind of avoid that, as well as the synergies that I've mentioned. But that said, I think that definitely in smaller markets like New Zealand, it's almost a practical necessity to have a major cornerstone investor to get yourself listed. A caveat to the caveat is in a place like New Zealand, they just don't have enough venture capital. So their venture capital firms need to bring in the other investors. And then on your other question about derivatives, secondary trading, once these shares are issued, the statute, first of all, bans them, says you can't sell them for a year. You got to hold whatever you bought for a year. But even after a year, the number of securities that are issued on any given company are so small that there's not really liquid markets for it. One more caveat. In the UK, with its somewhat mature market, they do have some secondary trading, and it's kind of like a bulletin board. Like, hey, I want to sell a couple of these. Hey, I want to buy them. It's really kind of a one-off deal. Thank you.
Andrew, that's great. The lead, what we might call a lead investor or venture capital investor, do they risk any potential liability in terms of almost creating a duty to people who invest based on the mere fact that they're investing, much less the fact that they're there to encourage the smaller investors to participate in the offering. There was a case a few years ago that involved that. I don't know that it was ever, resolved, but that's what I think that's a fair concern that a venture capitalist might have.
Yeah, no, I think that is a fair concern. I don't know if, off the top of my head, there's any specific statutory section or regulation aimed at that specific issue. But more generally, there is, if you perpetuate fraud in this securities market, that would be actionable under the securities laws, both by the SEC and by private investors that were harmed. And one of the private ordering methods that I didn't mention specifically is, but I do in the book, is called the digital trail. And that whatever you write or say is, at least here in the US, the internet never forgets. So whatever you write and say is there forever. And so if a venture capitalist were to say something false, you couldn't say like, oh no, you misremembered what I said. Now, would this make large investors too reticent to participate? So far, it looks like there are some, I don't know if they're kind of brand name venture capital firms that have participated in these sorts of offerings.
And do they ever make an express disclaimer?
No, I don't. Not that I can think of, but I think I've got an idea for a new article. So, thank you, Professor Lowenstein.
I'll look for the credit.
I'm seeking a co-author from an experienced securities. As Yesenia comes around to give another question, maybe over to this side, let me say hello to the people online. Thank you for tuning in.
I was wondering about the investors. Is there any data that shows the democratization of the investors? Are we seeing, whether it's low income or minorities, women, is that any different than what we would expect? And then second question, which is unrelated, what's going on in Asia? What's going on in China and Korea and Japan and India? Are they interested in this type of approach?
Okay. Again, thank you for these questions. I really appreciate it. Do we have? We definitely have 500,000 investors each year. Who are they precisely? I don't know if I have precise data. Anecdotally, at least, I would say that it's probably I'd say disproportionately male and white, but with this number of people, there really are all types. And then the other thing I'd say on this point is one way you can kind of search for opportunities on these various platforms is they're tagged as like female founder, African American founder, immigrant, Latina, different things, and people really are specifically seeking out those through the search engines and otherwise. So if I can't say for sure if the investors are in the same demographic group, but they're specifically seeking them out. And again, I just think by the sheer numbers, we have some nice diversity of investors. And then finally, on the question of Asia, what is going on there? Yeah, Malaysia has a pretty active market, and I think Indonesia as well. China really had kind of 10 years ago had this kind of a large one, but there turned out to be a good number of kind of dodgy companies, and it hasn't really flowered. Korea passed a statute. I was over there a while ago, and I don't know how active it is, but I'm in the midst of a world tour for the book, and I think I'm looking at the fall to head over to Asia, so I'll have a better answer for you then. Well, so let me welcome the Dean back to the podium. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor Schwartz. That was tremendous. I'm sure many of us, and I'm among them, could just ask you questions all night. However, we need to end the formal portion of our program right now. I am pleased to say, however, that you will have further opportunity to chat with Professor Schwartz just next door in Betcher Hall. I can also let you know that members of the audience are going to get an email early next week with a link to CLE, Affidavits Continuing Legal Education, for those of you who are attorneys and who are seeking credit for having attended this lecture. And with that, I am going to end and say thank you so much to those of you who are here live, those of you who have joined us virtually, and thank you once again, Professor Schwartz, for your wonderful lecture and for your work. Thank you.